Well, I got indoctrinated into this very early, Mark, because the game that made me a Michigan fan when I first moved to the state of Michigan, when I was in, I think, the fourth or fifth grade, was the weekend before Thanksgiving, and we had lived in Florida, and I just fell in love with football in Florida, but primarily the NFL. And the first Saturday that we lived in the state of Michigan, I'm flipping channels, and the 1983 Michigan Ohio State game, for younger guys, this is going to sound weird. It wasn't on national television. Actually, it was on local cable, local access cable, and Michigan had a broadcast, and Ohio had a broadcast of their own. So if you go find a streaming version of the 1983 Michigan Ohio State game, and these were two teams I think ranked in the top 10, 12 in college football. You've got Keith Byers and Mike Tomczak for Ohio State, and Steve Smith and Rick Rogers and Bo Schembechler for Michigan, and yet this wasn't on national TV for no reason. That was just kind of how things went back then. And you'll see it was on local cable, and each state had their own local cable broadcast, and just seeing those winged helmets and under the gray November sky, and I mean I was just instantly hooked. The fight song and everything else. So my fandom was literally birthed into was birthed by this rivalry. Now the funny thing is, though, throughout much of my early childhood, I understood the history of this because I've always loved history and I read up on it right away. But Michigan pretty much dominated a lot of these years. And for me, with being born in Iowa and having so much family in Iowa, and traveling back and forth, that was the peak of the Hayden Fry era at the same time. And so for me, Michigan and Iowa was often the bigger rivalry until later on, and in particular, when Jim Tressel changed the trajectory of the game, and over the last 20-25 years in particular. And I really think now, with the way the two schools have recruited, they've won the last two national championships. The offseason vitriol, from one side, Michigan cheated with Connor Stallions. The other side, Ohio State had a plant on the Michigan team to turn them in. I mean, this is the stuff of great rivalries. It's the stuff of drama, of history. And, the year I was born was 1973, and that was the year that Woody sent his team out to tear down the MGO Blue banner before #1 Ohio State played #4 Michigan in Ann Arbor, and led to almost a riot there inside the Big House. So, I mean, I think it was just providential from the beginning that this game was going to be a huge part of my life. And it got to the point that I couldn't watch it anymore, Mark, after what happened in 2019. I mean, I just was tapped out. 18 and 19 were just, physically embarrassing to watch. And then in 20, we didn't know at the time, it ended up being the greatest strategic retreat since Dunkirk. Michigan figuring out how to not play that game. If Michigan plays that game with a depleted roster, Ryan Day probably does hang 100. Jimmy gets fired. And then the next 3 years, arguably the greatest 3-year run Michigan football's had since Fritz Chrysler, E. Fielding Yost, never happens. And then last year's game, I think, was kind of an epilogue. The last vestiges of those teams to go down in Columbus and pull by point spread the biggest upset in the history of the game since 1969. I think that was kind of an epilogue to that particular era of Michigan football. And now we have Sharon Moore, who's undefeated against Ohio State, but he's gonna deploy a lot of guys who have never played Ohio State before, particularly on offense. And then we have an Ohio State team that doesn't have any. I mean, I don't know, Mark. You tell me, as an Ohio State historian, I know a lot of Ohio State history, but it's native to you. When was the last time Ohio State had a team go onto the field against Michigan and no one on the roster has won a Big Ten championship or beaten Michigan before? I would imagine it has been more than a few lunar cycles, brother, since that has happened. And so we've got the consensus top two high school quarterbacks in the nation in the last two classes going up against each other now as well. Probably the first of several such clashes. We're looking like it's looking like snow in the forecast again at the Big House, to give this kind of like Shakespearean kind of aura to the game. I mean, it's mystical, Mark. And, this, I think, is going to be the 50th time the two teams have played when both are ranked. No other rivalry in college football even comes close.
it depends if you consider 1992 as it was proclaimed by Gordon Gee, the president of the
Oh, the
Ohio State
tie. Yeah.
University, as the greatest win.
Yes.
The tie.
Yes.
Throw that aside. In 1994, of course, they stepped on the field and the Buckeyes finally broke a long drought. But that would have been the group of players that, since they lost in '88, basically without the tie, through '93, would have been the pocket of players. And obviously those groups of Ohio State teams were not achieving, 11-win seasons. Like, this is just unprecedented to be winning 11 games in a season, but keep losing to Michigan. Now, before I let Corey jump into this conversation, let me frame one other thing up, because you size this up about as well as anyone. But I'm also getting a take here that if your aesthetic gene or ability to just recognize true aesthetic quality would have been sharper and better, that you would have been in Ohio State. You saw the maize and blue, and then you saw those beautiful silver helmets and that classy look of scarlet and gray on the other side, and you gravitated to that ugly, dingy blue and yellow. Just don't understand that.
It's a deep, rich blue, Mark, and it's a robust, dripping maize with it is in fact replete with drip, as the kids say today. You bet.
Okay. Well, they say that styles make fights, and of course we've seen that over the course of sports, in different types of sports. But you lay out the land fairly well when it comes to categorizing Ohio State in a certain way, the culture of this football program, the university, everything involved, the fan base, versus what Michigan brings. And again, styles make fights. And if they're similar in certain ways, which make it fascinating, but they're so different in other ways that also, bring in that dynamic.
Well, one of the things that's been interesting about this rivalry is, I think what people maybe have failed to understand is there's really only been one era where it was a true back and forth year to year. You didn't know who was going to win. And that was that was, you want to talk about, that wasn't just Shakespearean, it was Arthurian. I mean, that's this golden age of Hollywood known as the 10-Year War, right? I mean, master against pupil, father against son. I mean, after Bo's father died when he was younger, Woody basically was, he'll tell you, the closest thing to a dad that he ever had. And I mean, Bo spoke at Woody's funeral. Woody frequently visited Michigan practices. That's right, Michigan practices in the later years of his life. All the while, often giving the Friday night gold pants ceremony pep talk to the Ohio State team under his old running backs coach, Earl Bruce. And then for me, on a personal level, I got to know Woody through Earl, because Earl late in life coached our arena football team here in Des Moines. And that was one of the first teams I covered in sports talk radio. And in order to kind of kiss up to me and get me to like the team more, the owner, Jim Foster, after he hired Earl Bruce, he knew I was a huge Michigan fan and college football nut. So he introduced me to Earl, and Earl and I got to become actually pretty good buds later in life, early in my career. And one of the great moments I've had in my career was at the Latin King restaurant in Des Moines, Iowa, over lunch one day after a couple of martinis, and Earl Bruce just let it rip with every Woody Hayes story you could possibly imagine. None of them can I repeat in this forum, by the way. All right. And some of them I've told some of these stories to presidential candidates, senators, governors. That's how good some of these stories are. And they just don't make them like that anymore, and Bo built a team in Woody's image, literally. He was Woody's offensive coordinator before he took over as the head coach at Miami of Ohio. Michigan was running the exact same offense, the exact same defense, the exact same culture as Ohio State. And so you had that era, now known as the 10-Year War, where things did kind of go back and forth. But even within the 10-Year War, Ohio State started out strong, and then Michigan closed strong. In fact, in Woody's last 3 games against Michigan, he'd failed to score an offensive touchdown in any of those games. Barring that era, for the most part, it's actually been wild swings where one team has controlled the game. And there have been inflection point games where momentum has changed. I would say the last 3 such games were 2021, when Michigan finally broke the seal under Jimmy. I would say 2001, that was when Tressel made the guarantee that we all laughed at the time, and then went up to Ann Arbor with a Michigan team that just needed to win and was in the Big Ten, or in the Rose Bowl, and was the Big Ten champion, and pulled out that game with a 7-win Ohio State team, and that kind of set the stage. The next year, Ohio State wins the national championship, and that kind of was the baton pass from Lloyd Carr dominating John Cooper to Jim Tressel. And then 1969. Well, when the Michigan program was as down as it has been, we have seen ever, until the Rich Rod Hoke era, and Bo upset what he would later say was his greatest team that year. The 1969 team, defending national champions. They brought everybody back because they were a largely sophomore-driven team in 1968. And they won every game by at least 27 points. ABC actually sent their B network team to do that game that year because they thought there was no chance Michigan was going to win, and then ended up being called, quote, the upset of the decade. So there's typically been inflection point. Woody's hiring was probably the next inflection point before 69, where Michigan went from a period of dominance now to Ohio State becoming a national power again. And so the all-time record between these schools is very close. But it's because one team wins 5 or 6 in a row, the other one gets desperate, makes a key coaching change, and it swings back. Or in the case of Ohio State, 20 games in a row, whatever. Well, I don't count 2011. No, with all due respect to Shoelace and all the guys in that team, we beat an interim coach that year. It's almost more insulting to me that that's our only win. Like, I almost would have felt better we'd have lost that too. Like, I feel ashamed claiming that as a W.
Does that influence partly, Steve, because of Fickle, what he's doing now?
Some of it, but also just the interim tag, right? So but it's historically been a rivalry of swings. It's not been a rivalry of back and forth year to year. These two teams at the top at the same time. They've been at the top at the same time a lot, but often one team's kind of had the other team's number. We haven't really seen a lot of back and forth year to year in the history of the rivalry.
I don't have a ton to offer this conversation, as I told you prior, Mark, but just the ins and outs of this matchup. But I do want to ask you both a general question about the playoff and positioning. And this may fall on deaf ears to a lot of Ohio State and Michigan fans, because I'm still learning. I mean, I got friends that just moved back to Columbus that were here. They grew up in Cleveland, and I kind of learned about the Ohio State Michigan rivalry from them, because it's totally. Steve, you've been in Iowa a long time. You understand where I'm coming from as a guy who grew up with Iowa State as being the rivalry, and it doesn't mean anything close to what Ohio State Michigan means. None of Iowa's 4 rival trophy games mean anything close to what this game means. So I'm still trying to process the idea that a regular season game could potentially mean as much as a national championship could. But I mean, there are people that would argue that. So I want to ask you about playoff positioning, even if it does fall on deaf ears. What would have to happen if all chaos broke loose during rivalry week? You have Vanderbilt losing to Tennessee. If you had BYU losing to Central Florida, Alabama loses to Auburn. If Michigan plays Ohio State close, does the name brand and 9-3 without really any great wins, does that get them? Can they move up enough? Is there enough room for growth with a loss?
I don't think so. I think with the schedule we're playing next year, yes. I mean, next year's schedule is yowza. Okay, but with the schedule we played this year, no. In fact, I think there's way a higher likelihood at 10-2 with an Ohio State win Michigan doesn't get in. And I don't know what those odds are. I'd probably guess 20-30%. But I think that's way higher than Michigan with a close loss, given the overall resume. Listen, in most years, Michigan playing Oklahoma, Nebraska, Michigan State, USC, and Ohio State would be like yowza of a schedule. But, several of those teams didn't amount to much. So they kind of just look like, doorstops, traffic cones on the way to the game. So I would say no. This is one year, and we always have the hand-wringing, as you well know, of, well, these teams, what do they all win? And they never all win, right? Well, we're down to one weekend left, and there's a lot of teams poised to finish that with brand names or nice records and resumes, or great stories like Vanderbilt that are poised to finish with 10 wins, who are not playing each other here in this last weekend. So this is the closest to kind of a nuclear, scenario for the committee that we have seen in the playoff era, where how are you going to parse these various teams? I mean, I think there's a scenario where Michigan wins, Washington beats Oregon, and Michigan goes to the Big Ten championship game and just gets outclassed by Indiana and is sitting there with 3 losses, and they're the runner-up team in the Big Ten and don't get picked for the playoff.
I mean, to each his own opinion on that. I cannot imagine a 10-win Michigan team. Maybe I'm reading way too far into branding, but a 10-win Michigan team with a win over Ohio State not getting in the playoff?
I don't think the odds are great, brother, but I don't think they're 0. I mean, what happens if BYU is 11-1 and plays number 5 Texas Tech onto the last play? What happens if Vandy goes and beats Tennessee and they're 10-2? Their overall resume, other than the Ohio State game, would probably be stronger than Michigan's. What if Ole Miss is 11-1, but Lane Kiffin leaves for LSU, but they're 11-1? I mean, I think there's a lot of intrigue still to come for sure. But the first thing Michigan has to do is win this game in order to get into that conversation. And there were several games this year I didn't think they were going to put themselves in position to be in position. It has been one of the weirdest years of Michigan football I can ever remember. This is the testing of depth. I mean, I still don't know how good of a game day coach Sharon Moore is, but in terms of recruiting and roster construction, he had to really rebuild the last 2 years on the fly. We lost so much after Jimmy left. And then Jimmy's recruiting the last 2 years by our standards was not very good. He was slow to embrace NIL, was really hesitant about paying guys and what that did to the locker room. And then Ward Manuel is a notorious tightwad and wasn't eager to pay guys anyway. So our 2 recruiting classes before he left were very substandard by our standards. And that's why we're playing 7 freshmen right now on offense, 7. And so I mentioned this to Mark last week. There was no other team in America that had the delta between yards per play on offense. We were 20th. That's awesome. I mean, that's excellent. 20th in the nation in yards per play, 65th in scoring. Right. And so how do you explain that delta? Turnovers, mistakes, penalties, missed assignments, breakdowns, inconsistency. And you get that when you're very talented, but 7 of the guys of your 11 on offense are freshmen, and you have 3 different offensive line starters than you started the season with. And so there's been a lot of chemistry issues, a lot of consistency issues. And so it was a fight for Michigan to even get here to 9-2, to be in position. And that's the problem we have, is what's that second really good win? What is that? The closest would be Washington. I think if Washington beats Oregon, they'll definitely be ranked. They might even be ranked tonight at 8-3. I'd rank Wake Forest instead if it was me, but they might be ranked tonight when the playoff rankings come out. We don't know. And then maybe that lends more credence, but I don't think there's great odds Michigan will be left out, but I don't think it's automatic either. I'd say if Michigan wins, and then how does Michigan win? Like, does Michigan knock Julian Sayin out? Does he get his bell rung? Is he held out of concussion protocol in the first quarter? And then the next 3 quarters, you're playing a backup? Right, that may give us subjective committee rationales for moving some pieces around later if they have to.
So when you talk about this Michigan team being a strange season, more so than what you've seen in the past, that leads me to believe that you're surprised by certain things. So what has surprised you about this Michigan team? And then I'll add on the Bryce Underwood evaluation of, you had to have some level of expectations of what is the season going to look like in terms of him statistically, how he handles situations, handles himself, shows progression from week to week. How have those 2 things progressed through the season?
I think the number one surprise has been special teams. This is the worst special teams unit in Michigan I've ever seen. And I have watched live every football game this university's played in the last 42 years. And then I've gone back and watched the broadcast and film of every existing game this program has played since like 1964. I've never seen a special teams unit this bad. Put it this way, Andrew Marsh, I think, had a 14-yard punt return in his first game as punt returner against Maryland last week that instantly made him Michigan's leading punt returner for the season. Dominic Zabata was an All-American last year, like an alien. He almost went pro early. Mark knows he played a pivotal role in the Ohio State game last year. He's got the yips bad. I mean, he's 12 for 20 this year, and most of his misses are like inside 40 yards. He's got the yips. And then the punting. They thought they had a transfer portal punter. Something happened. Nobody really knows. And then he didn't show up for fall camp. And so, this Hudson Holland back, one kick will be 48 yards. The next one will be net 14 yards. It's just been, special teams have been a mess. And for the way we play, and Mark, your co-host will get this, we play a very Iowa style of football, just with better recruiting classes. It's very complementary football based. Special teams, field position matters greatly in how Michigan plays. That's part of our ethos, the DNA of our program. And so the amount of hidden yardage, I mean, Samaj Morgan, for the first 10 games of this year, if he wasn't fumbling the punts, he was the worst punt returner in any power conference team. So that hidden yardage, when you've got such a young offense and a rookie OC, that's a huge factor. And yet I think the offense is actually underrated and the defense is overrated. I thought the defensive line would be maybe as good as it was last year. No Grant or Mason, but 3 deep at every position. But it's been good. I mean, I think it's probably a top 10 defensive line, maybe 15, but it was supposed to be better. I think the secondary's good-ish, but there is no one corner there that you can just say, all right, hey, Will Johnson, you go get Marvin Harrison. And as long as we go 50-50, we're winning the game like we did a couple of years ago. All right. And Marvin beat him on a couple plays and Will beat him on a couple plays. And that was enough. We got a stalemate and we could then win the game at the line of scrimmage. We don't have that kind of corner this year. Offensively, this is the first time. I mean, Michigan almost came into the game with a 100-yard rusher in every game leading up to it for the first time. I mean, we're going to go back to the Tamunga, Biaka, Batuga, Tyrone Wheatley, Ed Davis era. Mark, you'd remember that. That's one of the best 3, triumvirates at running back Michigan's ever had. We're one game off. We were very close. I think Justice Haynes got like 89 yards against USC before he got hurt. Otherwise, we would have pulled this off in every game. And they've been with 3 different tailbacks and multiple different offensive line combinations. And this offensive line is really coming along, particularly in run blocking. They are moving people. And the 3 best players in this line are redshirt freshmen. So with another year of strength and conditioning, that will be absolutely a Joe Moore candidate offensive line a year from now. Pass blocking, they've gone from shaky to adequate to getting there now. Right. And then some of that is the young quarterback, too, and how much he holds onto the ball and forces them to protect longer. So I think the offense, if people just look at the counting stats, you got to look at the advanced stats and you'll see in the advanced stats. I mean, Michigan's had five games this year where they had 400 yards or more and couldn't get to 30 points. Right. So you've heard of regression to the mean. There's progression to the mean, too. So you keep doing what Michigan was doing week in and week out. Sooner or later, you'll play a clean game and kind of break out. And that's what happened against Maryland last week. So I think the counting stats have overrated the defense and made it look like it's kind of a top 5 or 8 defense, probably more of a top 15, 20 defense. And I think the counting stats have made it look like offensively, they've not taken a huge step when they have taken a huge step if you look at some of the more advanced metrics.